Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Vitkov is already publicly urging the United States and Europe to urgently lift all energy sanctions against Russia so that the Kremlin can freely trade oil and gas with Europe. Steve Vitkov is calling for the complete unblocking of all gas and oil pipelines from Russia to Europe, arguing that this will supposedly save the European economy. According to a report published today by Politico, and as an example, he mentions the city of Schwedt in Germany, which has a huge oil refinery that used to operate entirely on Russian oil. This plant is not operating at full capacity. Of course, they have diversified their oil supplies and now they are not processing Russian oil. Nevertheless, this prompts discussions in Europe about the idea that the European Union will supposedly have to return to buying Russian gas and Russian oil. And Steve Vitkov is now trying to negotiate behind the scenes with Europeans, with European politicians, so that they call as loudly as possible for lifting sanctions against Russia. Let's discuss this topic together based on material from Politico. And before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like and write any comment you want. Subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechy News, link in the video description. There we post breaking news as soon as it comes in. So the publication Politico claims today that Steve Vitkov has become the main lobbyist in Europe and the United States for lifting energy sanctions against Russia. The article from Politico begins with statements by Anna-Kathrin Hoppe. She is the mayor of the German city of Schwedt, who complains that the city could simply die, and the city has a population of 30,000 people. And all these 30,000 people were supposedly previously provided with jobs thanks to the oil refinery located in this city, which always operated specifically on Russian oil, which it received through the Druzhba pipeline. This is a city in eastern Germany, and Hoppe states that Berlin should take action, even if it means returning to Russian oil. But in her opinion, and I'll quote her next, people and everyone in Schwedt need to know how hard it is to accept this new economic reality. Of course, we don't accept the war, but traditionally we've always had good relations with Russia. And in this way, she is calling on Berlin to start taking action to resume the supply of Russian oil. And as Politico writes, these calls demonstrate Europe's growing puzzle across the continent. A bubbling chorus of business leaders and politicians is urging the government to reconsider its tough stance toward Moscow. While ceasefire talks hang in the air and economic anxiety grows. Essentially, there are numerous legal and political obstacles. Officials in Berlin, Brussels and elsewhere are putting up barriers, even pushing new plans to end the European Union's dependence on Moscow for good. But this reserve may not necessarily remain. If the political mood changes, the fighting stops and struggling industries start demanding access to cheaper Russian oil. For the first time in many years, the possibility of resuming or increasing supplies from Russia seems possible again, writes Politico. And so, shortly after the dictator Putin's troops launched a full-scale advance on Kyiv, the European Union imposed sanctions against Moscow's key economic source, fossil fuels, that is, oil and gas. As Politico reports, Europe has nearly eliminated its long-standing reliance on Russian energy supplies in just 3 years. Pipeline gas imports have been reduced by 2/3, and seaborne oil and coal supplies are completely banned. But as Politico writes, Donald Trump appears. The promise of the returning United States president to end hostilities has given oxygen to voices in the European Union claiming that a ceasefire could herald the return of Russian energy resources to the European market. They say once the fighting ends, everything can be bought from Russia again. Europe's economic stagnation, as well as gas and electricity prices that are still twice as high as before the war, are adding even more fuel to the fire. The far-right forces of the European Union, from the Austrian Freedom Party to Bulgaria's Revival, have long been calling for the resumption of supplies from Moscow. But now mainstream politicians, including Italy's Minister of Energy and officials from Germany's ruling centre-right party, are also refusing to rule this out. Well, that means they're not completely giving up on the idea that someday they might buy Russian oil and gas again. Even Ukraine's Sanctions Commissioner said it would be foolish not to eventually resume imports. Europe's energy sector is also interested in this issue. As Politico writes, in France alone, energy companies Total Energize and Engie have stated that Europe could eventually increase its purchases of Russian gas by 40%. But this will happen as soon as the war is over. And in Germany, these debates are really gaining momentum. And politicians from both the ruling Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats are discussing the revival of the Nord Stream pipelines from Russia to Germany. Although Friedrich Merz insists on sanctioning these pipelines. That is, Friedrich Merz says that there should be no revival at all. But in politics, they still keep discussing whether it might be worth resuming. A representative of the German Ministry of Economy stated that the country, quote, set itself the goal of becoming independent from Russian oil as soon as possible, and has successfully achieved this. But the pressure will definitely keep increasing. Keeping in mind that local politicians, such as the mayor of this city, Šved, will continue to rock the boat and claim that without Russian oil they simply cannot survive at all. So how does Politico write about it? Located in seclusion among dense thickets of trees on the outskirts of the city, the oil refinery in Šved embodies this shift. It refers to the rejection of Russian oil, which is responsible for supplying more than 90% of the oil to Berlin, its giant airport, and its network of enterprises. From paper mills to pipeline processors, the facility faces a number of challenges. But now pay attention. After the cessation of Russian imports, the facility now operates at 80% capacity and receives oil from the German Rostock pipeline, the Polish port of Dansk, and from Kazakhstan via the Druzhba pipeline. But then Politico reassures a bit and says that bringing Moscow back to supply this oil refinery, for example, in Švety, is not being considered. Well, you understand that this is just one particular example. It will be very difficult, even if the sanctions remain purely political and more political than legal. The fact is that after the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, Germany temporarily took control of the oil refinery, taking the controlling stake from the Russian company Rosneft. However, Rosneft still owns shares. Therefore, any attempt to resume supplies from Moscow would require the European Union to completely lift the oil embargo. From Poland, it would require allowing the transportation of Russian oil through its pipeline network, and from Germany, it would require forcing Rosneft to sell its shares to banks and suppliers in Germany. As you can see, it's not that simple. After that, new legal contracts will need to be signed. And although, as the publication writes, the new owner will still have to convince other shareholders and suppliers that they won't be affected by future sanctions. In any case, this largely remains a political issue. The Nord Streams have a similar story. European supporters of the pipelines, which now lie in ruins deep beneath the Baltic Sea, have demanded that Russian Gazprom settle its legal disputes before any serious talks about reviving supplies can begin. The German regulator also has to approve the flow of Moscow's gas. If there is political will, they say it can be done, but again, it will be very, very difficult. Ukraine is another potential route for the resumption of Russian gas to the European Union after the war, according to European sources. The pipelines crossing Ukraine once carried half of Moscow's exports to Europe. But these flows stopped in January this year after Kiev allowed the transit agreement with Moscow to expire. Nevertheless, according to Politico, leading European politicians remain determined to completely stop any imports of oil, gas and petroleum products from Russia. In May, German Chancellor Merz promised to ensure that Nord Stream 2 would not be put back into operation and even supported the introduction of new European Union sanctions against these pipelines. The European Union is also rushing to implement plans to completely stop supplies from Russia. Last month, Brussels proposed a bill to completely stop gas imports from Moscow by 2027. And as Lithuania's Minister of Energy, Vaisiūnas, stated, quote, "It is absolutely clear that we have already learned the lesson that dependence on energy imports from Russia does not come without a price. So sooner or later we will have to pay for it. We will not go back to this. Even a ceasefire in Ukraine is not equivalent to long-term peace." But, as the publication writes, achieving all this is far from guaranteed. There is legal uncertainty regarding Brussels' legislation on phasing out gas, while countries like Austria, Slovakia and Hungary want to leave the door open for Russian imports. At the same time, Budapest and Bratislava constantly threaten to respond by lifting European Union sanctions against Russia. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has lowered the Western price cap on Russian oil, selling its oil through an army. These are those shadow tankers with completely opaque owners. In addition, the European Union's proposal in 2022 to allocate 2 billion euros to help factories that are giving up Russian energy has produced no results. At least in the European Union countries most dependent on Russian energy resources, such as Slovakia and Hungary. Although there are questions for the Slovaks and Hungarians here, what did they actually spend all that money on, and why haven't they found new suppliers? And so the German government once promised 400 million euros for the modernization of the German Rostock oil pipeline and to help this city shred in replacing Russian supplies, but Brussels still hasn't approved new funds for this reorganization. Although I want to emphasize again, this plant in the city of Schwedt is operating at 80%, even though it no longer receives any Russian oil at all. And now in Germany, they're really starting to manipulate the topic of East Germany, hinting that, well, look, there's a population there that lived under Soviet rule for a long time. Even now, sociological surveys demonstrate the significance of this. Many East Germans still consider themselves second-class citizens compared to the historically wealthier western part of the country. Meanwhile, Germans with Russian ethnic roots are almost twice as likely to support the alternative for Germany compared to their peers. They say on the one hand there are a lot of Russians there in Eastern Germany, but on the other hand there are quite a few pro-Russian sentiments there, and they say political parties will have to take them into account. And some even suggest that Eastern Germany might be able to push through the idea that Russian energy resources could partially return to the European market. But behind closed doors, opponents fear that Germany's abrupt shift will simply trigger a domino effect across all of Europe. Because Italy, Austria, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, and so on, they'll just, well, do the same thing. But they'll say, listen, if Germany resumes buying Russian energy resources, then why can't we do it? Bulgaria will do the same. So will Slovakia and Hungary. I'm not even mentioning the rest. I mean, this would really trigger a domino effect, and it won't lead to anything good. But here, the external force is even stronger than the internal pressure. This is Donald Trump. And as Politico writes, despite his campaign promise to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, the United States president is struggling to make progress. A ceasefire? The former reality show star hesitated about further sanctions against Moscow, while at the same time praising the Russian leader and persistently supporting closer economic ties with the Kremlin. Does Russia want to establish large-scale trade with the United States when this catastrophic bloodbath is over? And I agree, wrote Trump after a 2-hour conversation with Putin in May. These debates are also fueling his administration, the most interesting part. At the same time, White House Special Representative Steve Vitkov wants to lift energy sanctions from Russia. According to two people familiar with the matter, Interior Minister Doug Burgum would prefer to push Moscow out to make room for more imports from the United States of America, which, by the way, seems quite logical. In any case, according to Politico, Europe's energy sector is at the center of this potential cooperation. Moscow is negotiating with Washington about restarting Nord Stream, supported by American investors. This worries Brussels. Trump and Putin want to divide the European energy market and create separate spheres of influence in Europe. Schwed could be involved in a United States-Russia peace agreement. According to reports from a German investigative publication, American investors are considering the possibility of buying Rosneft shares in this refinery in the city of Schwedt. This would give American firms a controlling stake in the enterprise. In an alternate universe, where Russia makes peace with the West and Ukraine in particular, Schwedt would look much more attractive. This is a quote from Clayton Siegel, an energy analyst at the Washington Center for Strategic and International Studies. In general, Steve Witkov's idea is that European Union legislation requires all these companies in Europe to be either fully European or non-Russian. The Americans are prepared to purchase the Russian shares in the Schwedt refinery and act as if it's no longer Russian-owned. But in reality, they're making money off all of this. Let's see whose position will win in the end, because we see that the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, is still against this idea. And here, even a purely nationalistic sentiment might come into play, like why are Americans coming in and starting to dictate to us how we should manage our energy sector? Steve Vitkov continues to surprise us, and not positively. Let's see what comes next. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care, everyone. Bye.